My next guest lost his father to Alzheimer's, so this is a topic that he cares deeply about. Congressman Brian Higgins, a Democrat from New York, and the sponsor of the Comprehensive Care for Alzheimer's Act, joins me now. Congressman, thanks for joining us. I do want to start off, because this is so personal to you, can you, tell our audience about the journey that you've had both personally and professionally to fight Alzheimer's?
Yeah, I lost my dad about about 15 years ago to Alzheimer's, and it altered his whole persona. He was a gentleman. He was beloved by his friends and his family, and he took on a very different demeanor because of the Alzheimer's that had pervaded his brain. And I often say it's a disease whose origins are unknown, but its end is absolutely certain. And it ends in taking your cognitive ability, taking away your independence, and ultimately taking away your life. And we don't know enough about it. And, even the treatments that we're using today, they're the Aricept era drugs that were developed in the 1990s. And they're minimally effective in delaying the onset of Alzheimer's, but only for a short period of time. So we just need to do much better. And hence, we created the Alzheimer's Caucus.
And you have legislation, as I mentioned, I was looking it up, 107 co-sponsors, 67 Democrats, 40 Republicans. Co-sponsors range anywhere from Maxine Waters to Greg Pence. So we live, as you know, in very polarizing times, but this legislation has attracted a lot of bipartisan support. Can you tell us a little bit about the bill and its prospects this Congress?
Well, the bill is simply designed to provide more research dollars to develop more effective means of dealing with a disease of the brain that is pervasive and growing. It costs the nation a lot of money. It's one of the leading causes of death for older people. And not enough is known about it to develop an effective therapy or drugs or vaccine to deal with it. You can only diagnose Alzheimer's in postmortem. And it's thought that there are these killer proteins called plaques and tangles. The plaques form around the nerve cell, causing the cell to die, and tangles form inside the neuron or the nerve cell. It interferes with the cellular machinery of the brain, which produces a protein that kills, the cell. So we have to find a way to deal with this. And, the region of the brain, the hippocampus, is where short-term memory is transferred to long-term memory. And it's thought that these killer proteins, plaques and tangles, accumulate in that region of the brain, which affects short-term and long-term memory.
You mentioned cost, and there's a high cost of Alzheimer's, obviously personally, but also you have a lot of government agencies wrestling with treatment. What is the 5 to 10 year outlook? And we have, as we have an aging population, Congressman, and we have a labor shortage. That's only going to get worse. I mean, these are big picture ideas. I mean, what can policymakers do, both in Congress and government agencies, to make sure that innovation happens, but also we have to be cognizant of Medicare, which was headed for bankruptcy?
Yeah, well, I think that treating Alzheimer's early with effective treatments is obviously the goal here. As I mentioned previously, the standard Aricept era drugs were developed in the 1990s. So obviously, there's not enough research dollars to develop effective treatments. Now, keep in mind, you've got the National Institutes of Health, which we fund every year, but you're competing with cancer treatments and research and the like. But it's obvious that we have not done a very good job as it relates to Alzheimer's because it's a disease of the aged in America. And up until the last couple of years, the life expectancy of people is much longer than it was historically. And as people live longer, they are more susceptible to these kinds of diseases like Alzheimer's. So research funding becomes critically important. And that's what this bill is intended to do, to give the National Institutes of Health the kind of resources that they need to do very, very aggressive research toward the goal of developing an effective therapeutic for Alzheimer's.
There are a lot of interested stakeholder groups, whether it's consumer groups or pharmaceutical companies, and you have government agencies regulating them, and that fine line of regulation but also not inhibiting innovation. What do you think, and what have been the best practices of making progress on Alzheimer's that you could see the healthcare stakeholder groups? What's their role, and what can they do? Obviously, this affects Republicans and Democrats, as evidenced by your legislation that's supported by both parties. But the role of stakeholders, what do you think they can do over the next several years to actually get closer to better treatments and a cure?
Yeah, well, I think, if you look at the history of drug development and vaccine development, it's usually the federal government that's first in, that does the basic scientific research. And as, a promising new drug gets closer to the approval process, then the private sector takes over. They go into clinical trials to test both efficacy, effectiveness, and safety of all these drugs. So I think the advocates should be pushing Congress to approve more money for Alzheimer's, and the justification is all around us. It's a personal issue for many people, and they become, the family members. It's a disease that afflicts not only, the person that has Alzheimer's, but those who love the afflicted. And those who love the afflicted become the greatest ambassadors, if you will, advocates for more governmental resources toward the goal of developing effective treatments.
You mentioned that this affects everybody, and African Americans and Latinos are included in that group disproportionately. So how can we ensure equity in clinical trials? That's a big issue right now.
It is a big issue, and I think the pandemic over the past 2 years and actually more exposed the fragility of the American economy and American society, and shows that there is a huge disparity in terms of health outcomes for communities of color. And we have to do a better job as it relates to that. So it's not only Alzheimer's, it's cancers, it's other chronic diseases that disproportionately affect communities of color. And it's true in Buffalo, it's true in Boston, it's true in Baton Rouge. And so these are trends that, we have to embrace toward the goal of creating a more equitable distribution as it relates to healthcare services, including pharmaceuticals, drugs, and other therapies.
Congressman Higgins from New York, we really appreciate taking the time and sharing your personal and your legislation, which obviously has got some momentum right now. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. And thank you to the Alzheimer's Association. They do great work here in Buffalo, but throughout the nation as well.